Alright, this video is going to be about the three classes of manufacturing costs. So in this chapter, in chapter 2, we start to lay some foundational stuff. So some concepts and some ideas that basically the rest of the course hinge on. Understanding, what our three classes of manufacturing costs are. We'll talk in another video about variable versus fixed versus mixed costs. We'll talk about the manufacturing process flow, so how all of these costs basically work their way through the company. But these things are foundational. They tend to come up quite often throughout the rest of the course. So when we talk about the three classes of manufacturing costs, basically we're trying to come up with what are the inputs that go into the product that we make. So what does it cost us to do what we do? Whether we make widgets, whether we make window frames, whether we make fridges, stoves, it doesn't matter. We have to understand what it costs us to do what we do so we can stay competitive. Again, because the marketplace is becoming so global, if you don't really truly understand your costs, you won't be able to compete. So many different industries are moving more and more to an RFP process where companies are no longer just saying, hey, you've been supplying me for 20 years or 5 years or 3 years. You can just keep doing that. They're constantly going to this process where they have people bid on their business. So if you don't understand your costs, it's almost impossible for you to bid effectively on that business and to do so in a manner that will allow you to still make money, right? So to be able to bid on all these different contracts that might be coming up, you need to understand your costs. In managerial accounting, when we ask about costs, what should come up in your mind at all times for the rest of this course, when I say what is the cost of, the first thing that should pop into your head is, okay, he's asking me for the cost of something, I need to think of three things: direct materials, direct labor, and manufacturing overhead. Now, it might not be laid out as clearly as that in every single question, but at the end of the day, in a manufacturing setting, or even in a lot of times in service-based settings, labor, overhead, materials, those are your inputs. That's what it costs you to do what you do. So what this video is going to do, and it's not going to be a very long one, we're just going to go through and we're going to talk about what are direct materials, what's direct labor, and what's manufacturing overhead, okay? Because those, again, are your three cost inputs: materials, labor, overhead. Okay? So this is a little bit different for a manufacturing company than it would be for a merchandising company, right? Effectively, a manufacturing company is buying raw materials or buying inputs and they're converting them to a finished good which they can then sell. That's a little bit different than, say, someone like a Walmart, a merchandiser, who basically buys the finished product and just marks it up and resells it to us. All right, so in a manufacturing setting, we need to come up with what are those three cost inputs. So let's start with direct materials. Effectively, these are the raw materials, the basic materials that you use in your production process. So if we were making widgets and they are made out of aluminum, the raw sheets of aluminum would be our raw materials. Okay, they're pieces of material or units of material that we're going to craft and convert and change into something different throughout our production process. Okay. The key with direct materials, not indirect, but direct materials, is that they have to be physically and directly associated with the finished product. So for example, they give us some good examples down below. When we're making bread, well, the flour that we use to make bread is a direct material, right? We can directly trace that to making the bread. Syrup and the bottling of soft drinks, Coca-Cola or Pepsi, steel used in making automobiles, like I say, the aluminum in my widget example, so the sheets of aluminum, those are raw materials that are directly associated with making the product. If you can associate a cost directly with making a product, that obviously makes it a direct cost, in this case direct materials. Okay, so think of this manufacturing company. They've got all these raw materials. Well, they can't just let it sit there. It doesn't just magically become the finished product. What they typically have to do is they have to start to convert it, and they start the conversion process. To do so, what they have to do is typically invest in some direct labor. Okay, so now people are going to start taking all these raw materials and they're going to start to convert them into a finished good, into a finished product that they can then sell. So the cost of those people that are directly involved with the conversion of the raw material become direct labor. So bottlers at Coca-Cola, the bakers at Sara Lee, typesetters at a newspaper are all great examples of direct labor. Those people are directly involved with converting the raw material into a finished good. Okay? So those are our first two costs: direct materials, direct labor. Okay? The final cost that's included, so when we think of a cost, what is the cost of? We think of three inputs: direct materials, direct labor, and this thing called manufacturing overhead. It's the catch-all. Manufacturing overhead is basically, it basically captures everything else that's required to make our product, but that isn't directly associated as a direct material or direct labor. It's effectively everything else that's not direct material and direct labor. Okay, so an example, they talk about indirect materials and they talk about indirect labor, and then they talk about things like amortization on factory buildings, insurance. So when you think of overhead, you have to think about what are all those kind of ancillary costs that we accumulate or that are incurred that are required to manufacture our product but may not be directly associated, or maybe they're indirectly required to provide the service that we provide, right? Think of this from the perspective of your education. So your teachers would be considered direct labor. They are directly associated with providing you the service and the learning throughout your educational process. So a teacher's salary would be considered a direct cost of providing you your education. But there's other things that are required that aren't directly associated with providing that service to you. They're indirectly required. So the fact that we need a campus here at Fanshawe College. So the cost of the building, the amortization on the building, the cost of having the lights on in all the different rooms. Well, there's a lot of different classes that go into all these different rooms. So the cost of having this room and of having these lights turned on and of having the overhead projector, all those things are indirectly required to provide you with your education. So they would be considered indirect costs. Okay? Insurance on the building, property taxes, support staff, so the administrative staff up in whatever office you go to, right? They're not directly associated with delivering the course content to you and providing you your education, but they're indirectly required to provide you that service. So they would be considered indirect labor, right? From a manufacturing setting, indirect labor could include someone like a supervisor. So a supervisor may not be directly associated with taking raw materials and converting them to a finished good, but without the supervisor, things probably wouldn't run as smooth, or things might not get done in the fashion they're required to. So that supervisory salary or labor cost is required, but it's indirect in nature. All right. So you've got your direct materials, you've got your direct labor, and now you've got this manufacturing overhead, the catch-all. This captures all other product costs that are not direct materials and not direct labor, right? So we've already talked about the indirect material or the indirect labor a bit, and we've talked about some of the other amortization and all that kind of stuff. But when we talk about indirect materials, what are these kinds of things? They give us some examples at the bottom: lubricants or cleaning supplies or polishing compounds. Another good example would be a manufacturer that makes wooden tables and wooden chairs and desks and those sorts of things. Well, they're not going to have a tube of glue that's just primarily associated with just this one desk type. They're not going to have another tube of glue that's associated with making this chair and another tube of glue that's associated with making that table. What they'll have is they'll just have wood glue that they use for all of their products. So it's required to make all the different things that they make. They have to use it to do what they do, but it's not directly associated. It's not like it's the wood that was physically taken to be converted into that table or into that chair. It's indirect in nature. So it gets captured by the manufacturing overhead umbrella. All right? You'll see that this manufacturing overhead piece becomes a huge part of the rest of the course, simply because of the nature of the way things are done these days, and the advancements in technology and the amount of technology that's used in manufacturing. More and more of a business's costs are sitting and residing in this manufacturing overhead. So you'll see that as you move on to job costing and process costing and ABC, activity-based costing, you'll see that those chapters talk significantly about how to allocate out this overhead. Once you accumulate it all, well, how do we now get it into the cost of our product? We talk about that in future chapters. So for right now, you just have to have an understanding of what is manufacturing overhead. Okay, and it includes indirect materials and indirect labor and things like amortization and, or some of the other examples they gave, insurance and property taxes, any maintenance on any of your facilities. Okay, so those are your 3 cost inputs. So again, for the rest of the semester, when I ask you or when we talk about what is the cost of, you should be thinking about direct materials, direct labor, and manufacturing overhead. And you should have an understanding of what goes into each, or what qualifies something as a direct material or as a direct labor, or what makes something an overhead cost. Okay? Now there's not going to be a video on it, but you should review in the text in Chapter 2, you should review the difference between a product and a period cost, because it goes a long way to helping this all make sense. All right? So that's it for this short little video. We'll do another couple of videos, I think, on the manufacturing process flow and on variable versus fixed versus mixed costs. But that's it for the basics. We have 3 types of managerial cost inputs: direct materials, direct labor, and manufacturing overhead. Cheers.